Thank you so much. Thank you to the Arab Organization of Human Rights for having me. And it's such a pleasure to join these wonderful panelists to discuss a lot of these various issues. And thank you, Katie. That was very informative. I learned a lot from what you presented. My name is Tarek Khalil, and I am the Education Coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, and a board member of its Chicago chapter. American Muslims for Palestine works to basically educate, organize. So the Palestinian people worldwide are commemorating now 75 years of the Nakba, which you highlighted, Roba, thank you so much, or catastrophe. And it's important to understand and properly conceptualize the Nakba, which was not a singular event or humanitarian experience, but rather represents the shattering of the Palestinian collective and led to the dispersal, dispossession, disintegration, ethnic cleansing, fragmentation, statelessness, homelessness, denationalization, subjugation, and the continuous oppression of the Palestinian people. So it is an ongoing project. But it also led to the consolidation of a shared national consciousness, a consciousness that is rooted in resilience, in resistance, and steadfastness, and a collective struggle for justice and liberation. That's why the Palestinian struggle has gained a lot of traction over the years, even with the pitfalls that came with various frameworks in the last 20, 30 years. So here we are, 75 years since 1948. In the United States, it is no longer anathema to describe Israel as an apartheid regime. In fact, polls show that the younger generation, American polls, show that the younger generation, or what are called Gen Zs, have already crossed the threshold into being more sympathetic to Palestinians, Gen Zs and millennials. And a lot of, some of that has to do with the human rights reports that have come out vis-a-vis apartheid. So these various human rights organizations joined what Palestinians always understood and wrote extensively about, and that is that Israel is an apartheid regime. The mainstreaming of the apartheid label was assisted by, for example, the B'Tselem position paper, which is the Israeli human rights organization on apartheid, titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid." Human Rights Watch put out a detailed analysis, one of the most esteemed human rights organizations, describing a reality of apartheid and persecution. And the title of its report is "A Threshold Crossed," and I'll get to that in a minute, essentially implying that Israel over the years turned into an apartheid regime. And the most comprehensive of the reports came from Amnesty International, where in its title, apartheid was described as a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. These human rights reports are a great step forward and essential reading because they flesh out the reality on the ground and how we can move the narrative forward on the question of apartheid and pressure the powers that be on dismantling the system of domination and control. However, it is of utmost significance that the point of departure for an apartheid analysis stems not from the notion that Israeli policy over the years turned the state apparatus into a system of apartheid, as these human rights reports do, but that Israel's foundational ideology paved the way for the creation of an apartheid system. So this point of departure is the essence of the Palestinian intellectual tradition. And it is the point of departure that these human rights reports on apartheid completely missed, or I would think feared to even tread. So Israel's foundational ideology is Zionism, which is a form of nationalism that is predicated on European conquering ideology and necessarily infused with a settler colonial project. Apartheid is the natural outgrowth of Zionism. It is impossible intellectually, philosophically, historically, linguistically to divorce Israel's founding from its foundational ideology. Therefore, the proper characterization is not that Israel over the years since 1948 turned into an apartheid regime, but that Israel was founded as an apartheid regime. The various elements of the definition of apartheid, as defined in the 1973 Apartheid Convention or the 1998 Rome Statute. Racial domination, inhuman or inhumane acts in the context of systematic oppression. These elements are part and parcel of Zionism. They're not part and parcel of decades that eventually led to policies that consume those elements. These elements are inherent in the concept of Zionism from its ideological foundations up until its eventual takeover of Palestine in 1948. So it's important that we understand apartheid as an inevitable, unavoidable outcome of Zionist settler colonialism. This is the proper conceptualization of apartheid. These reports are essential in that they provide a lot of data, a lot of information, and these human rights organizations have a stature in the international community, and they have a respect factor that can lead to movements becoming stronger and can lead to policy changes from within, especially here in the United States, the number one ally for Israel, providing $3.8 billion in aid each year. So otherizing the indigenous population and relegating them to second-class citizenship status or as occupied subjects did not begin in 1967. That's usually the departure point of analysis when we talk about Israel-Palestine. But in 1948, and even before in many ways, actually, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza in 1967, and imposing a brutal military regime in those areas is an intensification and expansion of an already existing regime. And that's how we have to properly conceptualize apartheid. I want to get to the question of accountability. So while international law does not provide perfect justice, it's the mechanism we have in place to provide some modicum of accountability. The International Criminal Court is such an institution. The ICC's founding treaty, which I just mentioned earlier, the Rome Statute, which also defines apartheid, was put into force in 2002. In January of 2009, Palestine as a state declared its acceptance of the ICC's jurisdiction without being a state party. The matter was eventually closed in 2012 because the ICC prosecutor at the time announced uncertainties regarding Palestinian statehood under public international law. But later on, in April 2012, Palestine's status was upgraded from observer entity to non-member observer state. And since the beginning of 2014, Palestine acceded to 36 multilateral treaties. And the important practical consequence of each of these extensions, including that of the Rome Statute, is that Palestine as a state for ICC jurisdictional purposes, now Palestine is allowed to act like a state within those treaties. And as such, in 2015, Palestine accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC over Israeli crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territories since 2014. And in December of 2019, after the prosecutor's nearly 5-year preliminary examination, it was determined that the statutory criteria under the Rome Statute for the opening of an investigation had been met. And just recently in 2021, the ICC decided that the court's territorial jurisdiction does extend to the occupied territories, namely Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This means that the ICC prosecutor can begin investigating Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the context of Palestine, crimes are ongoing. So it's important for us to remember that the ICC has jurisdiction for crimes already committed and crimes that are being committed as we speak today, and future crimes, which are inevitable. The Office of the Prosecutor continues to receive evidence of crimes as the investigation unfolds. So for example, the International Federation of Human Rights and its member organization in Israel, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, presented a joint communication to the Office of the Prosecutor denouncing alleged crimes committed by the Israeli Security Agency, ISA, against Palestinian detainees, and to include within the scope of the investigation the crimes of torture, inhuman treatment, unlawful deportation, and violations of the right to fair trial committed by the ISA. In fact, Amnesty International, in its report on apartheid, called on the United Nations Security Council to refer the entire situation to the ICC to include all of historic Palestine, not just the occupied Palestinian territories, but all of historic Palestine, meaning from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Who knows how long of a process this will be before we actually see real material justice, but we are moving in the right direction. And we can use this movement toward accountability in our daily activism. We absolutely can't just sit and wait for the ICC to impose justice. We must work collectively to achieve justice, freedom, and liberation for the Palestinians from the ground up through grassroots movements, solidarity movements, transnational and intersectional movements. And that is why, for example, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, the movement that brought about the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, is a tactic that has gained much traction over the years. It employs the logic of pressure, not negotiations, but pressure, and demands the bare minimum guaranteed under international law. The bare minimum. It's a minimalist demand, not a maximalist demand. But our media in the United States describes BDS as anti-Semitic. But such labeling is not having the same traction it once had. The American people are slowly but surely realizing that Israel is the colonizer and the Palestinians are the colonized, that Israel is the oppressor and the Palestinians are the oppressed. They're beginning to see that Zionist demands are the maximalist extremist demands, and BDS are the minimalist mainstream demands. And poll data shows that the more Americans learn about Israel, the less they like it. So our job is to teach so people can learn, and they will naturally oppose oppression and in fact side with the oppressed. And that's the position that we're in now, and that's the traction that we're gaining now. And I thank you for having me.